Joining me now from Beijing, Victor Gao. He is the director of the China National Association of International Studies, and with me in the studio is Shihoko Goto. She is the Senior Northeast Asia Associate at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Shihoko, we just heard from the historian Peter Kuznick, and he said that the United States did not have to use those nuclear bombs against Japan. Japan was close to defeat, close to collapse. What is the feeling about that in Japan? Do Japanese feel that there was no need to use these bombs against the country?
I think Japan is well aware that America had a number of options, including invading through other islands in Japan. What the Japanese are very sensitive about, though, is the United States argument that the ends justify the means. The U.S. argument has always been that dropping the atomic bombs have been ultimately led to less lives being lost, especially on the U.S. side, and that it curtailed the war. That may well be, but the fact is that people, even today, are suffering from the consequences of the nuclear fallout, and that kind of empathy towards those who continue to suffer to this day and who have suffered, not just their lives, but their health and mental welfare, that needs to really be recognized by the United States today.
So, at this time, 70 years later, given the level of devastation, tens of thousands of people killed, is it time for the United States to reflect on its actions 70 years ago?
What's very interesting is that Ambassador Ruth, 5 years ago, was the first U.S. ambassador to actually visit Hiroshima during the ceremony and pay his respects. This year, Caroline Kennedy was there. There has yet to be a U.S. president to go. I think it is a good time for President Obama or whoever his successor will be to actually go and really start a dialogue, not just in the United States and between Japan and the United States, but in the world about what does it mean to engage in war? How do we calculate lives lost? What is civilian targeting all about? What role can the United States play in the future? It should be a moment to look forward about U.S. engagement in the world.
Right. Victor Gao, what are your feelings 70 years later after these two bombs were dropped in Japan? I mean, the United States said at the time that one of the reasons they dropped these bombs was to bring the war to an end, to save lives, Japanese lives as well as American lives.
Well, today, 70 years ago, was a very, very important and momentous day in the history of mankind, because the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and then 3 days later, the nuclear bombing of Nagasaki were one of the most important decisions that mankind had ever made. I would say that while the loss of innocent life was always unfortunate, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki accelerated the end of the Second World War, and Japan always wanted to know why the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and consider that as if that's the beginning of history. But in reality, I think Japan should ask why Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed with nuclear weapons. And I would say that it was after sufficient time of warning given to Japan to surrender and to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, and the Japanese imperialists and fascists refused to surrender, and that triggered the inevitable course of action which led to the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Japan should reflect upon that and actually accept the terms, and also, consider the total action that Japan was involved in the Second World War, rather than only singling out Hiroshima and Nagasaki to bomb as if Japan was the victim.
Shihoko, how do Japanese feel about the fact that, the United States said that it had bombed those two cities in Japan to bring the war to a very quick end, to save lives on both sides, and also the fact that Victor just made, that warnings had been made, calls had been made for the country to surrender, and that they were ignored? The
bigger issue at stake right now is Japan a victim, or was it an aggressor during World War II? And if Japan simply focuses on the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it was certainly a victim. I do think, though, that Japan is making more active steps, but it should make more steps to look into the other side of its role in World War II and what it did in China and Korea and in Southeast Asia as well. But today, the anniversary of the bombing really should be something that transcends national politics. It really ought to be a time for us to reflect on what does it mean to engage in war, what cost should people, civilians, pay. And I think the Chinese concern about Japan harping too much on this and not looking enough at what Japan did is not a valid one, especially on this day.
Victor, and I'd like your response to that. Should we be transcending the actual events that took place 70 years ago? Look at war right now, what it does to people. Look at, civilian victims in war. We still see it up to this day.
Actually, I watched very carefully the ceremony that was conducted by Japan in Hiroshima today. And I listened also very carefully to what Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had to say, claiming that he had not read the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. That's hypocrisy, at its best term. I think if Japan did not read the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, Japan will never understand why Hiroshima was bombed by a nuclear weapon by the United States. And Japan should never single out Hiroshima and Nagasaki as if that's the totality of the war. Japan should go much further beyond that, go into the atrocities that Japan committed in the Second World War, all the crimes that it committed against humanity in China, in Korea, in many parts of the world, the sneeze attack on Hawaii, for example. And I think only by this can Japan really understand why nuclear bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because otherwise, Japan would always consider itself as a victim rather than the committer of atrocities against mankind in the Second World War. Japan should look at the totality of the events of the Second World War rather than only singling out Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a sense, very ironically, I would say, rather than saying that the United States dropped the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was the Japanese fascists who forced the United States to have no other better option than to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki by nuclear weapons to make sure that Japan surrender and accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration.
Okay, Shihoko?
I mean, if you look at history, it is very clear that the United States did have other options. This was seen as the one that would save the most American lives and that it would bring the war to a swift end. And that is an infutable truth. What this opportunity should be also is a time for the United States to actually acknowledge its role in World War II. And the United States' engagement in Hiroshima and Nagasaki has really been about, therefore, the United States wants to have renounce nuclear weapons, and this is one of the reasons why the United States is currently engaged with Iran, and it wants to do so with North Korea. And that's the narrative that it is following, which is also a very valid one. But at the same time, my argument would be, in parallel to that, the United States actually needs to think about what role it can play in the broader peacekeeping and the broader empathy in the world that we live in today.
All right, and I guess Japan has to look at what it's doing as well. I want to go to Victor for this. And Victor, if we come up to developments in Japan today, Japan is now looking at changing its pacifist constitution to incorporate a doctrine known as collective self-defense. It's being pushed by Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister, and if it is passed, it will allow Japanese soldiers to fight overseas for the first time. I mean, what do you make of a development like that?
I would say this is a very unfortunate development and also very worrisome development, mainly because this means that even though 70 years after the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are still politicians in Japan who have not yet learned the lesson, who still want to rewrite history of the Second World War, and who still want to give up the pacifist constitution of Japan. And I think what they are doing right now may bring Japan onto a course of dangerous developments into the future, and may actually inflict great damage and sacrifices to the Japanese nation, and may actually again cause great tragedies to happen to Japan, because if Japan rearms itself, gives up its pacifist constitution, goes abroad to engage in acts of war, and still want to repeat what they did, as a country of aggressor in the Second World War, then the Northeast Asian region will be disturbed, and countries like China and Korea, etc., will be alarmed. And I think developments in that part of the world may escalate and deteriorate, and war and conflicts may break out again. And again, I think Japanese politicians may bring disaster back to Japan, probably on the par with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki events. This is something that Japanese nation should reflect and rise up and oppose the dangerous actions of the Japanese politicians.
Okay, Shihoko, why is this happening in Japan at the moment? And there's many polls that tell us that the Japanese people are not behind what the leadership is doing right now.
That's right. About 60% of the Japanese public is against this reinterpretation of the Japanese Constitution, which was essentially imposed upon by the United States after World War II. That said, the Asia-Pacific region is facing a new reality, not least because of the rapid militarization of China and its aggressive territorial stance towards both the East China Sea and the South China Sea. On the other hand, Japan has depended essentially almost entirely on the United States for its defense capabilities outside of its own borders. The United States is being pulled in many directions. In the Middle East, there's concern about Russia. There's all sorts of concerns that it does have. And it's facing a tremendous budget crunch. So given those factors, and also the fact that there is a nuclear North Korea, the fact that Japan does want to be like other countries and actually spend a little bit more on its military capabilities and have the ability to be part of international efforts to keep peace in the region is being a realist in light of the changing situations of the Asia-Pacific.
Victor, what do you make of that security realities in Northeast Asia, in the South China Sea, have changed?
I would say Japan, after its unconditional surrender at the end of the Second World War, now has territorial disputes with Russia, with North Korea, with South Korea, with China, and with China's Taiwan province. That's a very shameful record. Even though Japan has no land-bounding neighboring country at all. Therefore, I think Japan should go back to history, read the Potsdam Declaration, read its commitments in the terms of the unconditional surrender at the end of the Second World War, and reflect what it's doing right now. If Japan continues with its dangerous courses of action, Japan may find itself in a very, very awkward position sometime down the road when its neighboring countries get alarmed with what Japan is doing, with what Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is bringing the disasters back to Japan. And I think situation may deteriorate very quickly. That's the lesson that Japan need to spend some time to consider, rather than, celebrating the Hiroshima event as if that's the totality of the Second World War. I think the United States and President Truman did the right thing to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki with nuclear weapons at the end of the Second War. History cannot be rewritten. That's history. Japan has accepted that as part of the term of the unconditional surrender, and no one will help Japan to rewrite history. The verdict of the Second World War is clear. No one can re-establish another verdict for the Second World War.
Victor Gao in Beijing, Shihoko Goto here with me in Washington. Thanks to both of you for joining us.